Answered in kind. 7. On the interior climate of the projective mind. There exists a particular morphology of consciousness, whose utterances arrive already armored, whose language does not inquire, but advances, whose speech is less an offering than an expulsion. It is not born of reflection, nor even of belief, but of compression, of psychic material forced inward until it must escape by whatever aperture remains unguarded. When such a being speaks, it is not dialogue that occurs, but decompression. This is not the voice of conviction. Conviction is coherent. This is the voice of unexamined affect, fear metabolized too slowly, shame never permitted to surface as grief, anger mistaken for vitality. The being who speaks thus does not experience themselves as aggressive. They experience themselves as endangered. Their speech is not an assertion of power, but an attempt to reconstitute a boundary that feels perpetually breached. Projection, in this context, is not a moral failing, but a structural inevitability. Whatever has not been rendered conscious must be externalized. The psyche, unable to endure the weight of its own dissonance, seeks an exterior receptacle upon which to fasten the attributes it cannot bear to recognize as internal. Thus, the other becomes the carrier of chaos, the repository of corruption, the screen upon which the shadow rehearses its drama. Such beings are often profoundly literal in their cognition. Symbolic fluency has atrophied. Metaphor is mistrusted. Ambiguity is perceived as threat. The world must be flattened into legible binaries because dimensionality induces vertigo. Complexity feels like erasure. Plurality feels like annihilation. And so language is stripped of nuance and sharpened into instrumentality. Each word a blunt implement designed not to illuminate, but to stabilize the speaker against the terror of indeterminacy. At the core of this orientation is a confusion between certainty and safety. The psyche mistakes rigidity for protection and imagines that if reality can be sufficiently constrained, it will cease to wound. But reality does not submit to coercion. It responds only to relationship, and where relationship is refused, domination attempts to fill the void. One may observe that such speech is often repetitive, incantatory, nearly liturgical in its cadence. This is not accidental. Repetition soothes the nervous system. The same phrases, invoked again and again, function as talismans against psychic dissolution. They are less arguments than mantras, less communication than self-hypnosis. Through reiteration, the speaker reassures themselves that the world remains predictable, that their map has not expired, that their position has not been rendered obsolete by the movement of time. Yet, time has moved, and this is the unspoken grief beneath the rhetoric, a mourning for a world that no longer conforms to inherited hierarchies of meaning. The speaker senses, often dimly, often with resentment, that the symbols which once guaranteed identity have lost their gravitational authority. Roles blur, categories soften, the old scaffolding trembles, and rather than grieve this loss, the psyche attempts resurrection through force. Force, however, is an incompetent theologian. It produces neither coherence nor peace, only escalation. For every attempt to impose order from fear generates further disorder, amplifying the very instability it seeks to extinguish. The psyche, now locked in adversarial relation with reality, interprets resistance as confirmation of threat. A feedback loop is established. Fear begets control. Control begets rupture. Rupture begets more fear. Within this loop, moralization becomes inevitable. The being cannot say, "I am afraid," for such admission would collapse the defensive edifice. Instead, fear is translated into righteousness. Anxiety is baptized as virtue. Aggression is rebranded as protection, and thus cruelty acquires a halo. It is essential to note this configuration is not limited to any single ideology, culture, or epoch. It is an archetypal posture of consciousness under siege. Wherever the self feels fragile and unresourced, it will attempt to stabilize itself by shrinking the world and policing its borders. Wherever interior authority has not been cultivated, exterior authority will be fetishized. Wherever self-trust is absent, enforcement becomes sacred. Such beings often display an intense preoccupation with punishment, hierarchy, and submission. This is not because they love order, but because disorder feels existentially fatal. They imagine that if transgression can be sufficiently punished, chaos will retreat. Yet, chaos is not external. It is the unintegrated remainder of the self. Punishment, therefore, never resolves it, only displaces it. There is also, frequently, a curious intimacy with humiliation. The speaker may deny this, but their language reveals a fascination with degradation. Who deserves it? Who should receive it? Who must be made small? This fixation often traces back to early experiences of powerlessness in which humiliation was endured but never metabolized. What was once suffered is now rehearsed from the opposite position, not to heal it, but to invert it. This inversion does not free the psyche, it binds it. For one cannot dominate one's way out of terror. One cannot shame one's way into wholeness. One cannot eradicate the shadow by assigning its citizenship elsewhere. The shadow follows, it always follows, and the louder the denunciation, the more insistently it knocks. There exists, however, an alternative orientation, rare, demanding, and unspectacular. It begins not with speech, but with pause, with the willingness to experience uncertainty without immediate resolution, with the courage to feel fear without transforming it into an enemy, with the humility to admit that one's perceptions are provisional, one's maps incomplete, one's inheritance not synonymous with truth. This orientation does not require agreement. It requires capacity, the capacity to hold contradiction without fracture, the capacity to remain present when the nervous system urges flight or fight, the capacity to listen without preparing a counterstrike. Such capacities are not innate, they are cultivated. They emerge from interior labor, from sustained attention to one's own projections, from the disciplined refusal to outsource self-regulation to domination. Language, in this alternative orientation, recovers its sacramental quality. Words become bridges again. Speech becomes an offering rather than a weapon. Silence is no longer feared, because identity is no longer dependent on constant assertion. The being can rest inside themselves without needing to dismember the world to do so. This is not weakness, it is maturity. And maturity does not announce itself. It does not shout. It does not need enemies to feel real. It understands that what we refuse to encounter within will inevitably appear without, and that the most radical act available to consciousness is the reclamation of its own interior weather. Those who cannot or will not undertake this work will continue to speak as they do, not because they are irredeemable, but because they are frightened and have mistaken fear for truth. They will continue to believe that louder speech equals stronger footing, that narrower worlds are safer worlds, that control is synonymous with care. They are mistaken. But they must learn this, if they learn it at all, not through humiliation, but through consequence, through the quiet exhaustion that accompanies perpetual vigilance, through the eventual realization that the fortress has no windows, through the dawning awareness that one has survived every imagined enemy except the one within. Until then, the rest of us are not required to absorb their projections, nor to convert them, nor to carry the weight of their unfinished homework. A closed hand cannot receive, and a clenched psyche cannot hear. One may stand present, speak clearly, and then step aside. The dust may be shaken without contempt. For consciousness evolves not by conquest, but by contact, and contact cannot occur where fear is enthroned. The age does not require louder voices, it requires deeper ones. And so, if any of this has stirred discomfort, let it not be taken as indictment, but as invitation. The purpose of illumination is not exposure for the sake of shame, but recognition for the sake of freedom. Each consciousness awakens in its own season, and no one is served by being dragged into clarity before they are able to stand within it. We are not asked to conquer fear in others, only to refrain from hosting it within ourselves. We are not tasked with correcting every distortion, only with tending the quality of our own seeing. Where understanding is possible, it may be offered gently. Where it is not, peace may be preserved without retreating from truth. There is dignity in knowing when to speak, and equal dignity in knowing when to step back. A closed hand cannot receive, and an unopened ear cannot hear, but the door of awareness opens in its own time, never by force. What matters is that we do not become what we resist, nor sacrifice our own coherence in the attempt to stabilize another's unrest. Let us then remain attentive, patient, and precise. Let us cultivate interior authority rather than exterior domination. Let us speak when speech serves clarity, and choose silence when silence serves peace. In doing so, we participate in the slow, unseen work by which consciousness matures, one encounter, one recognition, one relinquishment at a time. Answered in kind.